Welcome to the Living in Alignment podcast. My name is Amy Landry. Through a collage of conversations, here we distill mindful living and timeless wisdom within a modern, everyday context. Thank you for being here. Tova Olsson is a scholar of religion, an author and a yoga teacher with over 20 years of experience in educating. She is appreciated for her deep knowledge, her ability to explain esoteric ideas and philosophical concepts in an accessible way, for her skillful storytelling and humorous approach. As a scholar-practitioner, she strives to combine academic, critical understanding with the dedicated experience of a long-term practitioner, offering courses that provide liberating knowledge on many different levels. Tova holds an MA in Religious Studies from Gothenburg University and is currently working on her PhD at Umeå University, where she researches gender constructs in contemporary tantra in Europe. She lectures internationally on the history, philosophy, and mythology of yoga and tantra, and runs the online school Saraswati Studies. Tova, it is such an honor to chat with you again. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. Such a pleasure speaking with you again.
Absolutely. And the last time we spoke in depth, you were a guest on the Study Yoga Summit that I hosted. And I know that your session was a wealth of insight, and I have no doubt we're going to get another taste of that today. But we weren't able to actually dive into your personal story and your journey, your path. So I'd love to start our conversation today with that, if you don't mind. Can you share some insight with us about how you came to yoga, how you also came to the scholarly path as well?
Sure. I always find this so difficult, maybe because I'm so comfortable speaking about myself, or maybe it's because I've been practicing for so long. I don't really exactly remember what happened when, so to speak. I've been teaching yoga for more than 20 years now. So I started out in my very, very early 20s. I'm 42 now. And my journey, I guess, as a child, looking at my Murti of Saraswati here as we're speaking, I know that, my earliest memories goes back to reading and narration and writing. Like it was, I started reading when I was just 5 years old. And because my mother used to read out loud for me, and there were some books that I really, really, really loved. And so I learned them by heart first, and then I started to learn how to read. And as soon as I knew how to read, I wanted to write. And so some of my earliest memories, we were living next door to my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. And so in the early mornings when nobody was awake, I used to walk up to her house and I would sit on the little stairs leading up to her house, and like the porch, and I would sit there or in the hills right next to her house, and I would sit there and I would read. And she would come out with her cat. And she would say, "Oh, are you here reading again?" Because she wasn't a reader at all. She would just read the newspaper. And so she would kind of tease me about the fact that I was there reading again. And so my early memories are very much about reading, writing, and also, of course, loving music, loving movement, and also loving to draw and make art. So as we're going to speak about Saraswati, I know a little bit later, I guess, that was my early journey into yoga, even though we might not call those things yoga. And I was a gymnast as a child, something I started very early as well. And then later on, I had some accidents, as a lot of people do. And so I gave that up. But later on, when I came to yoga, I recognized a lot of the movements that I did as a child. And I didn't know them as asanas then, of course, but it was these movements that were very, very natural to my body. And then, of course, the dance was always there as well. And when in school, I was always, somebody that really loved to study. But I was also very restless. As a child and a teenager, I was really longing to see what the world had to offer. And so when I was 17 years old, I dropped out of school, the Swedish form of high school, you could say. And I moved to Paris. And I moved there to, excuse me, to write and to dance. And that's what I did most of the time. Of course, I also had to work. I worked as a waitress. I worked babysitting. I did all types of work when I was there. And eventually I came back to Sweden and then I started working as a language teacher. So also very much connected to Saraswati. Right? So I taught French and English, and I was just 19 at this time. And then I did a lot more traveling. I lived in the Caribbean for several years, and in the Caribbean, I was also very much engaged in traditional forms of dancing and so on. And then eventually, when I came back to Sweden again, then I had already started practicing yoga, I guess through books from the beginning. I asked some friends about this actually, like, when did I start doing yoga? Do you remember? They were like, well, you were like always reading these books and you were practicing by yourselves. And I don't really know where I got that from. But I did open my own yoga studio in Guadeloupe in the Caribbean at one point. And then I had just been practicing by myself, for a few years, but this was, way back in time. And as I said, when I got back to Sweden, eventually, I was working as a dance teacher. And in the dance studio, one of the dance studios where I was teaching, there was another dance teacher, and she was also teaching yoga. And so she needed someone to fill in for her because she was sick or she was traveling or something like this. And she said, well, you practice yoga, like, right? And I said, yes, I do, but I have no teacher training or anything like that. And she was like, well, I don't either. Nobody does, because this is in the very, very early days. It was very few yoga studios were available in Sweden, and just a few gyms where you had yoga maybe, one time per week or so, not every day like nowadays. And so I went and I stopped that class, and then the students were really happy with me. And they asked me to come back and teach again. And then before I knew it, I was teaching yoga in several studios, gyms, and dance schools and so in Gothenburg. And at the same time, I was also studying in the university. I studied literature, I studied anthropology, international relations, and of course also religious studies. And religious studies is what I ended up getting my bachelor in. And at that point, I wasn't so drawn to continue my studies because I was already teaching like 20 classes per week. And I really felt like I could see some beautiful, very pragmatic effects of teaching that I didn't really feel from my academic studies, that I was going to be able to impact people in the beautiful way that I saw with the yoga. And so more and more of a time, I started teaching less and less dance and more yoga. And I was always very interested in philosophy and mythology and those parts. So they were part of my teaching already from the beginning. And then, of course, over time, they took a greater part. And so I was teaching yoga for many, many years. And of course, I had many teachers along the way, and I did teacher trainings and things like this eventually. And somewhere along the line, after having two kids and being a single mom for several years, and so I decided to go back to the university. I wanted to get my master's in religious studies. And so I did that. And when I went back to the university, I really wanted to do something connected to yoga. I wanted to look at contemporary yoga teacher trainings and the philosophy part of them and the role of physicality. And I was also very interested in the fact that it was mostly women practicing yoga in the West and so. And when I came back to the university, this was not a popular subject. This is not something that was seen as an academic subject within religious studies in Sweden, even though modern yoga studies were on a rise, but this was just in the very, very beginning, like perhaps about 2010, something like this. And it took me some years. I got two masters. Well, in Sweden, we say one magister and one master. So the first one I did was about yoga teacher trainings in Sweden. And then I did my master on gender essentialism in contemporary tantra in Sweden. And then after that, well, I went on to do my PhD, which is what I'm doing now. And all of this have taken some time, of course, because I had two small kids at the same time. And I was teaching, of course, full time at the same time as well. So, well, I guess the progression was, moving away from teaching so many classes in studios and gyms and so on. After having my second child, my oldest one is 15 and my youngest one is 12, or they're turning 15 and 12 now in September. And so after having my now 12-year-old and becoming a single mother with both of them, I couldn't really teach as much as I did before. And so I started teaching smarter, so to speak, just teaching a few classes per week and eventually moving on to teaching online. Of course, with the pandemic, we didn't really have a choice, but I started my online school, Saraswati Studies, a few years before the pandemic. In 2018, I launched it. And so that has been a source of great blessing that Saraswati really pushed me into starting that online school. And now, as you might be aware, I teach mostly online. And that is, of course, also because I'm very busy with my PhD research and also teaching in the university. So yes, that is, a very short version of my journey, which is very much an intermingling of academic studies and sadhana and teaching in many different spaces. I also taught in the Swedish school system for many years as a language teacher, as a philosophy teacher, and also as a teacher of religion. So to me, those things are kind of, intermingled.
I love that. And I can definitely relate to the background in creative and performing arts, just being a steady, a steady force just driving you throughout your entire life. And I'm curious to know before we move on, is there any sort of defining moment or memory where Tantra became quite, let's say, important or influential on your path, or was that just sort of a slow transition into that direction in terms of the
Mm.
philosophy and the teachings and the techniques and so forth?
Well, I guess, as I said, when I became interested in studying yoga in an academic way, there wasn't a lot of yoga studies. Now we have a lot of beautiful translations of texts and so, but back in the days, like 20, 15 years ago, it was really difficult to understand where the different techniques that we were using, where they were coming from, which lineages actually knew what they were talking about. And I was really trying to figure out, um, where the different techniques were coming from, what they were leading towards, what we called yoga philosophy, where was this really coming from? So it was, many years of hard work, really trying to discern between Samkhya, Vedanta, Tantra, all of these different systems that I teach a lot about now in my online school. But I would say that as I did that research, I came to understand that a lot of the things that we are doing in contemporary yoga is Tantra. of course, even though people were reluctant to calling it that because Tantra, since the colonial times, have a really shady reputation. And also some of the schools that I studied within, one of the first teacher trainings that I did was within Anusara Yoga, that you might be familiar with, which was a school that had a lot of problems, of course, like most yoga schools, highly problematic.
I
But
will interrupt though, and I'll say it did produce a lot of incredible teachers though.
it did. And all of those teachers were connected to the Siddha Yoga organization in some way. And of course, the Siddha Yoga organization is also a highly problematic organization, but it did have a beautiful way of transmitting what we might call classical Tantra or Kashmir Shaivism or Trika Shaivism to the West, so to speak. And so a lot of the teachers that came through that school, like Sally Kempton, my teacher, like Douglas Brooks, many other beautiful teachers are people that have been really skillful at teaching Tantra to people in the West. And so I'm guessing through that school, I became familiar with tantric philosophy, which felt very, very home to my heart immediately. And then I so deepened my study with my teacher, Sally Kempton, who passed away last year. And also, I think the fact that I had my second child, who was a girl, and also became a single mother, that really pushed me into the world in a way that, it wasn't like I was ever a renunciator. So, but I definitely have had some renunciate tendencies. I was a great Shiva Bhakta, and I'd been practicing with Shiva mantras for many, many years. And I was definitely, on a path where I would like to do nothing else but do sadhana all day long. And so both of my kids came kind of as unplanned, beautiful surprises. And they really, as I said, they drew me on the path of the goddess and into the world in a way that I might not have been forced to if I didn't have them and if I didn't become, a full-time parent in the way that I did. I didn't really have the choice.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, I would say that that is the way of Tantra for me, very much being invited to the realm of the goddess and the realm of just spiritualizing my everyday life because I had so little time for formal sadhana, even though I made sure that I had time every day, even though I had a daughter that didn't sleep for the first 4 years of her life. And so I was,
Sounds
that
familiar.
yeah, it was really a pressure cooker. I really went into that space of limitation and a limitation that brings freedom in a way because you are so focused on your sadhana in those few moments when you can be. There was no Netflix or anything like that in my life. It was just the moment the kids were asleep, it was sadhana for me. But then, since I wanted more sadhana, than that 15 minutes or perhaps 1 hour or perhaps a little bit later on it was 2 hours or 3 hours, but I still wanted more sadhana than that, and so I had to spiritualize my life, and the goddess really helped me to do that, and my teacher really helped me to do that.
Such a gift.
Yeah, yeah, I'm not sure that I'm giving such clear
No,
answers.
that's beautiful and it makes total sense. And I think it just highlights how invaluable the tantric path or a tantric path can potentially be for the householder, and especially in our present day world and circumstances. And that just segues really beautifully where we're headed here. So let's delve into some themes that generally arise through your work and that you've already touched on a little bit, especially as you talk about the goddess and the mother and so forth. And just very briefly, let's start here. So, given that Sanskrit names or words, I should say, have various meanings depending on the context and the tradition, can you speak to Shakti? So, what is Shakti and how does this pertain to the path of any yoga practitioner?
Hmm. So Shakti, yeah, as you said, Sanskrit words have many different translation, but the translation of Shakti is often energy or power or creative capacity. So sometimes we will see that a male deity has a wife or a consort that is said to be his Shakti, his creative power, right? But we also have Shakta traditions, goddess traditions, where the goddess is seen as the creator of the world and the supreme power or the ruler of the worlds. And so in some of the tantric traditions, we see Shakti embodied in iconographical form as goddesses. Right? And so we spoke about the Devi Mahatmya last time when we spoke, which is one of the fundamental texts in the Shakta Tantra traditions. And in that text, that might be the first time around the 5th century that we hear about the goddess with the capital G, so to speak, because she's seen as the Mahadevi, the great goddess. And from that text and onwards, we have a lot of traditions where Shakti is seen as one, that there is just one energy in this world, but that this energy naturally takes many different shapes. And so we have many different faces of the goddess. And of course, we also have the understanding that Shakti lives within the human body in the form of Kundalini. So there is both the notion that Shakti energy is everything. Everything that we see in the world, everything that we experience within ourselves is that pulsating, vibrating power of Shakti. But we also have the notion that there is a condensed form of spiritual Shakti within the human body, and that this can awaken through the grace of the goddess and leads to our liberation or our knowing of ourselves. That is a
Mm.
short explanation.
Yeah,
How
that's
much?
perfect. That's so perfect. And okay, so with that in mind, which it is such a big topic, but you've pulled it together really succinctly, and I love it. So then from there, please share with us some insight into the goddess Saraswati, but also Matangi, which you've touched on briefly back in the Study Yoga Summit. But and your Instagram account has Saraswati in it, which I think you have indicated why, perhaps through your story, sharing your story with us. But if there's anything else you want to add, I'd love to know. But who is Saraswati, and is she the same or is she different to Matangi? Or is that disputed? Is that argued? And therefore, who is Matangi? What is she here to teach us?
Where to start? You will have to stop me eventually when I get checked. Saraswati, let's start with her name, right? So often translated as she who is associated with that which flows or associated with fluency. And so what is flow? Of course, water flows, and Saraswati in Vedic times is associated with a river that is now said to flow as a stream under the ground, as the intuitive waters. Some people will say that we can break her name down into Saras, meaning essence, and Swa, meaning one's own. And then she is the one who guides us towards one's own essence or knowledge about the self. And I've also heard some teachers break her name down into sarva, meaning all, rasa, all flavors or all colors. This, I think, is more to do with Matangi, but we will get back to this in a little while. So she's associated with fluency, with all the rasas, and with one's own self. So what is it that flows? Well, water flows, but language flows, music flows, the arts flow, right? And so when we look at the iconographical form of Saraswati, and I'm looking at her murti here on my desk, and I also have a great big painting right in front of me of her, she's often associated with the color white. In her mantras, we often say that she has the luminosity of the moon. And so she's white, not as a Caucasian person, of course, because she's a deity, she's made out of light. But she has this very, very bright light, moonlighty complexion, right? Which is associated with the quality of sattva. And so we're not going to get so much into the different qualities of tamas, rajas, and sattva, but this is qualities that originates in the Samkhya philosophical system of Sankhya, and we also work with them in Ayurveda, for example. And so the notion of sattva is a quality of clarity, of intelligence, a form of stillness that is absolutely clear. So when we think about water that is pristine and clear and you can see through it, right? That is the quality of sattva. And sattva is a quality that we aspire towards as sadhakas, as practitioners of yoga. It's not a quality that we can be in all of the time, right? We naturally need the quality of rajas, which is the quality of activity and passion and movement. And we need the quality of tamas, which is the quality of forgetfulness and stagnation and darkness and ignorance. When we go to sleep, for example, we need a quality of tamas in the evening. But the quality of sattva is something that we move towards as we go through processes of purification. And Saraswati is very much associated with purification. That's another aspect of water, right? It purifies. And the river goddesses in India, even though Saraswati is no longer so much associated with the river, we have the river Ganga, for example, that is very much associated with purification. So sattva as clarity, as discernment, as purification. When we get to the quality of discernment, this is something that is not so common, that we strive towards discernment within contemporary spirituality, and actually think that is a big problem, because one of the qualities that Saraswati and Saraswati also seen as one of the higher realms goddesses when it comes to the movement of Kundalini. It's not like Saraswati is associated with the very first movement of Kundalini. That would be a goddess like Durga or like Kali that really have the power to break through deep karmic patterns. While some of the more beautiful, so to speak, goddesses like Lakshmi and Saraswati are very much associated with refinement. So refinement in our spiritual practices, also refinement in our intellectual capacities, and so on. And so when we see Saraswati, she's often dressed in white. She shines like the moon. She's very sparsely decorated. She usually doesn't have as much jewelry and so as some of the other deities, because she's more connected with knowledge than with material, benefits. But she's usually riding a swan. And I live right by the ocean, in the city, but by the ocean. And when I take my daily walk, I always see swans almost every day. And so I always say a mantra to Saraswati when I see them. And the swan, of course, is very much associated with discernment. It says that the swan that Saraswati is riding, called Hamsa, which is, of course, also a mantra, that it has the capacity to separate milk from water. So to separate what is true from what is not true, what is appropriate at the moment from what is not appropriate at the moment, which is something that is very important for us as teachers, to know, right, what is appropriate to teach in this particular moment to this particular student. And so the swan also has this, of course, the white feathers that never really get dirty. So the swans that I see when I take my walk, they're swimming there in the ocean right by the harbor, right? The harbor of Gothenburg. And still the feathers are so white because they have this kind of repulsive quality to them. As when we talk about the lotus as well, that many deities have a lotus throne, and there's many reasons to that. But when a deity is seated on a lotus, the lotus also has this capacity to kind of repel whatever is falling upon it, right? So there's a beauty to the swan that is beyond this world in a way. It's not really affected by everything that is going on around it. And then what I find to be true about the swan and its connection to Saraswati is that Saraswati, as we said, she's connected to fluency. But how do we get to fluency? We get to fluency through hard work and discipline, right? When we have somebody that is fluent in a language, if it's not their mother tongue, even if it's their mother tongue, it takes a lot of time to learn a language, right? And when you learn a foreign language, you really have to learn the grammar. You learn to put little phrases together, and eventually you have fluency, right? And the same way with a musical instrument and or the classical dance of India or the classical dance of the West. All of these areas that are connected to Saraswati, they really take years and years and years of practice in order to have that sense of spontaneity or fluency in your performance. Or when we have a teacher, of course, that is talking about a subject that they know really, really well. And so it seems effortless when they're talking about it. And so when I see the swan is just floating on the surface of the water. But we know that right beneath the surface, the feet are pedaling, right? And when I think about this, I always think about all of the hard work that goes into teaching a subject or performing the arts in a way that just seems beautiful, spontaneous, effortless. So many years of really, really doing that work beneath it all.
Mhm.
Right?
You just took me into my Odissi dance studies in India and
Mm,
how, the any masterful Odissi dancer always looks so fluid and effortless, and yet at the same time, like their feet and their legs are just in this intense like energy and like stamping and making the music with the ganguru, the bells, and but also with the footwork. But yet people are
mm,
always looking up at the face and at the expression, at the lasya and the body movements and the hand mudras and so forth. And yet they're often completely unaware as to the really dynamic hard work that's going on in the lower body, in the legs. And that yeah, I guess in a sense it's a metaphor, but yeah, how you explain the swan there just took me into that. There's just so much hard work going on down below, and whilst everybody's seeing this grace up
mm,
above. Yeah.
mm. Well, I just posted something on Instagram today and about my teacher saying that she's the offering we make for perfection. Right, when it comes to, for me, academic writing, poring over the same texts for years sometimes and making sure that every little word is that it's truthful, that it's beautiful, and that it really, sings in the right way,
Mm.
whether it's poetry that we're dedicated to or academic writing, there's just, a sense of precision and perfection that is really what it takes to be a devotee of Saraswati. She's definitely a stern teacher and somebody that will not let us rest until it's just right. It's the power of discernment again. And I had absolute chills when you spoke about the dissidence. I know that the goddess is present because that's the way she communicates with me when I hear that something is absolutely true. and that's
Mm,
the
mm.
picture of what it takes to be in relationship.
Absolutely. And also, I think for any yoga practitioners and teachers out there, there's so much just even practical relevance and value in cultivating a relationship with Saraswati, because we are always, it's a lifelong path of studentship and study, and not only a pursuit of knowledge, but a pursuit of embodied transformative knowledge where there is again that level of mastery and perfection, where we're not just intellectualizing the knowledge, but we're then taking it into the practice, into the body, and allowing ourselves to be transformed from within through the amalgamation of the teachings and the knowledge and the studentship. I hope that makes sense.
Mm, mm. Yeah, absolutely. And so if we get back to the iconographical forms of Saraswati, I just want to make sure that I say these things. Of course, they're slightly varied depending upon the tradition, but she's usually seen holding the veena, like a stringed instrument, right? And this instrument, of course, is associated with the arts and with music and the fluency and the beauty of music, but it's also understood to be a picture of the human body. And so the base part of it is the pelvic bowl, and then we have the stringed part that is the spine, and then the upper part, which is the skull. And so when we see Saraswati playing this instrument, it is the picture of the possibility of her playing us as instruments. And so the deeper we go into our sadhana, we also realize that we begin to hear wisdom more in a more clarified way, perhaps. And so I often speak about Saraswati as associated with insight, with intuition, with inspiration, with intelligence. And all of these things, as we know as artists, don't come only through our own discipline and efforts, but they also come through grace, right? And we have so many stories and testimonies to this of great poets or playwrights or whatever it might be, that they feel like they just have to be there and make themselves available to this grace moving through them, and then try to hold on to it when once it's there. Right. And we also know days when we feel like there is no inspiration available and we can't force it. We just have to wait. Right. And Matangi will teach us a little bit more about this, that we can't force creativity. And sometimes we also see that Saraswati is flanked by a peacock. Sometimes she's even riding on it, but this is not very common. It's usually the swan. And sometimes it's said that the swan and the peacock are kind of opposites, that the swan is leading her towards spirituality, so to speak, and the peacock is leading us into the realm of the material world. But I would say that this division is not really that simple, because the peacock, of course, is the picture of the beauty, all the beauty that the world has to offer. But the peacock has this special capacity to eat, to kill and eat snake, and then to transform the poison into nutrition, into nectar. Right. And so, as an artist, when I look at the peacock next to Saraswati, I don't see it as Saraswati turning away from the world, excuse me, but as the peacock really embodying this capacity that artists have to take whatever the world offers us, even when it's poisonous, and transform it into art, transform it into beauty, transform it into something that other people can enjoy and relate to in different ways. And so that's what I see when I look at a
Mm,
peacock. Mm.
that's such an interesting perspective and a very helpful one. Absolutely. I would even go as far as saying a very tantric perspective too. Uh, and
Absolutely.
yeah, a practical one. So, is there anything
Mm.
else you would like to add about Saraswati to round that out before we move on, or shall we delve into Matangi?
Let's move into Matangi because there's a lot of similarities in between them that we can get into. Yeah, of course, Saraswati also holds books or script roles, something that is associated with the word and with knowledge. And she usually holds a mala, which is associated with spiritual practice, sometimes some kind of pot with water in it for purification again. Then when we look at Matangi, I'm looking to the side because I have another painting of Matangi here right next to my desk, and it hasn't been there for as long as the painting of Saraswati. And I actually think it's quite common that people might be in communication with the power of Matangi, but they mistake it for the power of Saraswati because she's a much more known deity. Um, but Matangi definitely is a deity of her own. Sometimes I think about her as an obnoxious little sister of Saraswati, doing all the things that Saraswati would never do, right? Because I very much associate Saraswati with, academic writing, classical music, classical dance, as I said, all of those art forms that takes so much nitty-gritty discipline. Well, Matangi, in the painting that I have here, she's dressed in red or pink. Her skin is green. Sometimes it's blue. And we have a form that is called Nila Saraswati. And Nila means blue, or sometimes green, or sometimes just dark or black. And so this Nila Saraswati form is sometimes associated with the Mahavidya Tara, and sometimes it's associated with Matangi. The Raja Matangi form, it's most often seen as the green form. We have other forms that might be blue or just dark. So what does it mean that we have like a light form of Saraswati, the orthodox, the Vedic form, and then we have this tantric form that is absolutely also associated with articulated speech, with the word, with the 64 art forms, it's sometimes said, but she's dark. She's different. Well, she is a Mahavidya. She's the second to last of the 10 Mahavidyas. And all of the Mahavidyas are forms of Kali. And so Saraswati, well, I would say that she keeps a distinguished distance to Kali, right? While Matangi, she brings a rawness into our expression, into our creativity that is different from Saraswati. So Saraswati associated with Brahma, the creator god. She's sometimes said to be born from the tongue of Brahma. Sometimes it's said that Krishna divides himself into two parts, one masculine and one feminine part. And the feminine form holds 5 Shaktis, and Saraswati is one of them. Sometimes it's said that Saraswati emerges from the tongue of Vishnu. Well, we see in all of these stories that she's associated with Vishnu or with Brahma, which are more orthodox deities, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak. While Matangi is associated with Parvati, with Kali, and with Shiva, that are tantric deities. And so there are different stories about how Matangi is born. In the Buddhist traditions, it's said that there's a sage named Matanga, and he has a daughter named Matangi, or sometimes she's called Prakriti, nature. And that this daughter, one time she's at home, she's doing her duties, and a young monk, a Buddhist monk named Ananda approaches. And so she happens to be a Chandala. Now, this name Chandala, it can mean many different things. In Vedic traditions, this was the people that took care of the dead bodies. that burned or disposed of the dead bodies, which was seen as something that was highly polluting, right? And so a chandala can also be associated with hunting, because also hunting and killing animals is something that is seen as polluted. And so she says that she's a chandala. Maybe her father is a hunter. Maybe she is part of this particular caste. And she asked if he really wants her to serve him water since she's in a polluted state. And he's a monk and he's saying, well, I don't care. I just asked you for water. I didn't ask you what caste you're part of. And so um, she's so pleased by the fact that he doesn't seem to care about what caste she is, that she falls in love with this young monk. And as he goes away, he goes to, his ashram or so, she goes to her mother, and her mother is called Mahavidyadatri. So Mahavidya, great mantra, great knowledge, and she is the holder or the one that has knowledge about this. And she says to her mother, please make this young monk become attracted to me. And the mother is a little bit hesitant because she's thinking that the power of the Buddha might be greater than the power of her mantras. But her daughter is so set on this man. She's so deeply in love with him that the mother decides to give it a shot. And so she builds an altar, and she starts doing different form of practices, mantra practices and fire rituals and so. And eventually the young monk feels this great attraction rising in him. And so he goes to seek out this young woman, Prakriti. But as he approaches the house, he sees the altar and he starts to weep, and he prays to the Buddha and he says, please, draw me out of this situation. And the Buddha arrives and helps him to get over his lust. And then the young woman says to the Buddha, well, I'm so in love with him. I have to have him. You have to help me with this. And then the Buddha says, the only way that you can be close to him is that you become a nun yourself. And so Prakriti realizes that she was a fool, just trying to, have sexual relation with this man when she was actually attracted to the spirituality in him. And so she becomes a nun, and she becomes a disciple of the Buddha. This is not really connected to the Mahavidya Matangi. It is and it is not, because we definitely see some tendencies here. She's named Prakriti. And Prakriti in nature is definitely something that Matangi is associated with. She has the color green on the first thing. She's often described as seated in the jungle or in the forest. And one of the ways that we can worship Matangi is to go to the forest and feed wild animals. So she's definitely associated with nature. And then we also see that she's a Chandala, or Chandali. She's associated with pollution in different ways, or the forbidden, the unorthodox. And her mother is associated with the Mahavidyas, or the great mantras, and also with magic and this power of having somebody become really, really attracted to you. When we see the mantra to Matangi, one of the mantras that I chant every day, one of the lines in this mantra says, make me capable of controlling all beings. And one alternative rendition of this line is, make me the friend of all living beings. And so Matangi, like some of the other Mahavidyas, like Bagalamukhi, for example, are some of the deities that are very much associated with black magic and the capacity to control other people. Of course, us as yoga practitioners or tantrikas that are on the yogic path, so to speak, we don't think about these deities or don't use these mantras in this way. We think about them as cultivating inner states, right? And Matangi is absolutely associated with this capacity of befriending the world in a way. And so we have these little things that we can say, well, it's Matangi, it might not be Matangi, but then we have other stories about her. One is very interested where Parvati and Shiva have invited Lakshmi and Vishnu to come for dinner. And of course, Vishnu and Lakshmi are bringing the food because they're very much associated with the world, and Parvati and Shiva are much more associated with renunciation. And as they eat together, they happen to drop some of the food on the ground. And from this food, a maiden arises and she says, can I please have your leftovers as prasad? So prasad is the food that we might get in a temple. Somebody has offered food to the deity, and when we get the food back from the deity and we eat it, it's seen as prasad. Or if we offer something to the deities on our altar at home and then we eat it afterward, it's seen as prasad. Well, Matangi is one of the very, very few deities that will eat leftovers. So she arises out of leftovers and then she asks for more leftovers. So this is also one of our strong associations with something that is in a state of polluted. Because when this has to do with pollution, and we can talk more about that, the fact that she's a non-dual goddess that will embrace all aspects of reality. Right? But there's also something about the prasad when we get the food back from the deity, or if we would offer something that we have already tasted, the food has already touched the mouth. And so anything that has touched the mouth in Indian tradition is in a state of pollution. But what has also touched the mouth? Of course, the spoken word, known as Vaikari in Tantric tradition, has also touched the mouth. And so everything that we say is in a way in a state of pollution because we can't really express the truth of something or the pure state of something. But it comes out in a way that is maybe not precisely exactly that. I said, as a devotee of Saraswati, we really strive to say it exactly as close to truth and beauty as possible, but we can't really, and Matangi speaks to that, the fact that we can channel divine wisdom, we can channel the grace of the guru and so on. But when it comes out as the spoken word, there's still an aspect of pollution or lack of clarity there. And so as this maiden arises and she asks for leftovers, Shiva blesses her and he says that you will stay in this form and people will know you as Matangi, and you will be a deity that people have to approach before they can approach me. And so we see this in several of the stories about Matangi. We see that she's associated with Shiva and that she's somebody that we have to pass through in order to get to Shiva, to get to consciousness, which is interesting. And there's another story of her where Parvati sits on the lap of Shiva and she says that she really has a longing to go and see her parents. She wants to go and visit the Himalaya. And she says, can I please? She asked her husband if she can go to see her parents. And he says, yes, you can go. But if you linger too long, I will come and fetch you personally. And so she goes to her parents' home. And obviously, Shiva thinks that she stayed too long. And he goes there in the disguise of somebody that sells jewelry. And he knocks on the door, and Parvati opens, and he offers her all of this beautiful jewelry. And she takes a few pieces, and then he wants her to pay with sex. And so she's deeply offended. And she's about to curse this vendor, but then through her yogic powers, she can see through the disguise and she sees that this is her husband and she thinks two can play this game. And so she says, okay, I'll pay you, but I will do it a little bit later. And then she closes the door. And then later on, she goes to visit Shiva and she goes in the form of a chandali. She goes in the form of a huntress. And it's said in the text that, she has a beautiful body with large breasts, the usual description from the patriarchal traditions. And she's dancing, she's wearing red, she has wide eyes, and Shiva is so um, taken by her. And he goes out and he says, "Oh, beautiful maiden, what are you doing here?" And she says, "I came to do penance." And he says, "Well, I'm the one that you offer penance to." And then he embraces her. And then as they make love, he turns into a chandala. He turns into somebody that is an outcast or of a low caste, a polluted caste, and he recognizes his wife. And when they're done with their lovemaking, Parvati asks a boon from Shiva, and she says, "Can this form that I made love to you, can this form stay? And it will be worshipped in the world, and everybody that worships her will have all of their desires granted." And Shiva says yes to this. And then we have another story where Shiva has a sister. We never hear about his sister in any other story, and she's known as Kauriba. And she's a person that really likes when things are clean and in order. And so, needless to say, she has a lot of problems with her brother, who is, smeared in ashes. He's keeping really bad company. He likes to hang out in the cremation ground and so on. And every time that Shiva comes to visit her home, he drags all of this dirt and polluted beings into her home. And so she curses her brother. And Parvati is really distressed by this. And she decides to honor her husband, and she curses Kaurava back. And she says, "Because you were so obsessed with purity, you will be born in a very, very polluted place among the casteless ones." And so she's born in a low caste in Varanasi, the state and the place where people go to die and their bodies are cremated. And she's so unhappy about this. And she goes to Shiva and she says, "Please bring me out of this polluted state." And Shiva says that, "You will have to stay here and learn to not see any difference between purity and pollution. But I will bless you so that people have to go and visit your temple before they visit mine in Varanasi." And so here we see again that Matangi is somebody that you pass through in order to get to Shiva. And we see the same themes coming up over and over again: the pollution, eating the leftovers, sexuality in many, there's like an erotic sense or fulfillment of desires are also there. But when we look at Matangi in the Dasamahavidya sequence, which is very much about the evolution of Kundalini in the spiritual practitioner, Matangi, as I said, is the second to last. And the one that comes before her is Bagalamukhi and Dhumavati, goddesses that are very much associated with going into the void, going into a state where you have no more words, the sacred pause, the place in between. Bagalamukhi is often seen holding the tongue of the demons, really representing the arrestation of speech. And so we see that the state of Matangi, which is the state of a form of creativity that is deeply your own, an individualized creativity that is your authentic voice coming true. And that couldn't come true before going through all of these other wisdom qualities out of the other goddesses, including that deep desert known as Dhumavati and that sacred pause known as Bagalamukhi. And this really speaks to, as I said earlier, how we can't force creativity or how we can't expect to be in a constant state of just output, output, output. But we also have to have periods where we are just silent, when we are going into the void, when we go into that desert and we just sit with things. right? And so Matangi is that explosion of color, of creativity, of articulation, of inspiration that comes after these fierce goddesses. And when we speak about the Kundalini progression, so to speak, in the Dasamavidya sequence, we have the movement up from the base of the body all the way to the crown of the head, and then we have the movement back down. And as Matangi is one of the goddesses that comes in the very last part of this sequence. She's really the movement back into embodied liberation. And that we, according to the tantric tradition, liberation is not transcendence, moving away from the body, leaving our relationships behind, but is coming into the body and in this individual form with the knowledge of the divine, but also being able to express ourselves in this individual way. So it's not at all about wanting to, escape the individual form, get rid of the ego, all of these things, but it's really touching the absolute and then being able to live that through this individual form. There's so much more to say about Matangi. Of course, both are associated with thunder, with rain, with water that is moving towards the ocean. In one of the stories about Saraswati, she's a divine goddess, and she takes the form of a river in order to take out a great big fire that is threatening to ruin the entire cosmos. And she takes this great fire and she brings it towards the ocean. And some teachers will say that Saraswati, she's water as it kind of descends from the heavenly realm, like the purest, purest state that we can imagine. Like when the Ganga is just, flowing down from the mountains, that's Saraswati, that pristine, cold quality of the water. But then as the water moves down through the mountains and down through the countryside, it becomes full with all types of stuff, right? And eventually it takes on a different color. And that can be said to be Matangi. It's the same water. It's still divine. It's still pure in an absolute sense, but it also takes on the qualities of the world, right? And that is Matangi. But in a very simple way, we can say that they are not the same, though they are both holding the Vena, they are both holding scripturals, often they're holding a mala. But Saraswati, I would say it's much more associated with the classical arts. And Matangi is much more associated with a form of individual wild creativity that is much more associated with nature, also with sexuality, and just, saying what is on our mind. Me sometimes, when I do a podcast like this or when I teach, I sometimes regret things I say afterward. I was like, oh my God, I talk too much. Why did I say that? And then one of my friends who is also a teacher, she says, well, that's kind of the Matangi quality, to also say those things that might not be so conventional, but they needed to be said still, and they needed to be said by you. So her name, Matangi, some teachers will say that Mata means a thought or a word. And so she's associated both with the formation of a thought and then the actual Vaikari, the human speech, the articulation of that thought.
I almost feel like Saraswati is what we might be pursuing, that highest, most refined quality or state or creativity or speech. And yet Matangi is the kind of practical, more tantric, more like realistic, here I am present in daily life with my perfections, my imperfections, and that more, not so much materialistic, but material embodiment in some sense. But I do like the mention that you said earlier that they're almost like sisters. Like she's like the younger sister, and it's almost like they've got the same DNA. They're the same blood type, same DNA or something, but they are still unique in themselves. I don't know if
I
that would.
think that Matangi, yeah, Matangi is so associated with joy as well. Sometimes her name is said to mean, um, the one that dances with passionate limbs. And that this is supposed to associate her with an elephant in heat. So Matanga is sometimes also a name that is associated with an elephant, which also brings her into associated with Ganesha. And Ganesha is, of course, also associated with Saraswati. But coming back to the joy, I think that some of the things that bring us on the path to Saraswati are from the beginning imbued with joy, perhaps writing, dancing, playing our musical instrument, whatever it might be. And then because of the strictness of Saraswati, it kind of dries the joy out of the creativity sometimes. And then Matangi is the one that really can make us come back into the joy of movement, of writing or whatever it might be, and to feel that, okay, I'm allowed to express myself in this way as well. So for me, for example, it's very important to have the academic writing, which is very much like choreographed dance. I have to follow a certain form. And then a more free movement, like a free form of dance and a free form of writing that really takes me into the realms of Matangi and a much more individual expression.
Mhm.
So that's how I also
I see that
think
coming
of them.
through your Instagram posts. I feel like there's
Yeah.
so much depth and passion, but it's not having to be refined like you do in sort of, academic work and research
Mm.
and whatnot. It's just coming through you. And I really do love following you. I feel so inspired by what you share on Instagram, on your social media. It's just, you're so rich with knowledge. And I think that comes through every time you speak, whether it's this conversation or when we spoke last time for the summit. And I would really like to highlight for anybody listening in, if they're interested in learning more about the Dasha Mahavidyas, not just them separately individually, but this thread that you alluded to, which you definitely spoke to more in the summit, but that thread and that process, let's say, that connects them all together. Then you've obviously got your online course on Teachable that is a sort of an ongoing, on-demand course, so you can jump in as you wish and delve into that incredible knowledge and wisdom that you have to offer. But is there anything else you would like to add on that? Because I'd like to just close with asking you about your book. So do you feel like you've tied that
Mm.
in a bow? Is there anything else you'd like to add on Saraswati or Matangi?
Oh, I'm sure I'm gonna think about lots of things when we know it all, but find me on Instagram and you
Absolutely.
can read about
Absolutely.
those things. I wanted to say, well, the last thing I wanted to say about Matangi and Saraswati is about my teacher, Stella Kempton, and her book, Awakening Shakti. So Matangi is not one of the goddesses mentioned in that book, but she told me that Matangi was very much the force behind that whole book. And she was really so masterful at speaking about, really complicated spiritual subjects in a very approachable and still in-depth manner. And that is something that I really aspire to follow her in.
That's an incredible resource, as is all of her work and her books. I've had a couple of her books for so many years that have just been a guiding light, and definitely books that you can continue to return to and revisit. So I'm really grateful that you mentioned that. And speaking of books, let's just briefly touch on your book. So Yoga and Tantra, History, Philosophy and Mythology. So this is obviously an incredible resource for yoga teachers and practitioners. So can you just briefly share with us, firstly, what the process was like writing this book? Like, was it a very academic process? Did it come out of your academic work or not? And of course, how this aims to serve the wider yoga community.
Yes, I taught a course, a full year course on the history, philosophy, and mythology of yoga, maybe in 2017, 2018, I don't know. Because I really wanted to offer something for yoga teachers that felt like they didn't really get to dive deeper into those things, that it wasn't really offered in yoga teacher trainings, and so we don't really have the time to go into those things deeper. So that course held a section on the history of yoga, on the different philosophical systems that we refer to when we speak about yoga philosophy, and one section on the Yoga Sutra, Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana, the Devi Mahatmya, the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, the history of Tantra, and interwoven into all of this, lots of mythology. So we spent 1 year doing that, and we saw each other one time per month. And for every month, I would make them read material that I had written. And so at the end of that year, I didn't want to teach the course again in that format. I didn't really have the time because I was writing my master at the same time. But I was thinking I can probably do something with this written material, because I was teaching in several yoga teacher trainings, and I was always invited to come and speak about yoga philosophy or yoga history. And when I would ask people to read up, I would have to make them read, first of all, of course, English speaking, but also kind of dense academic material. And I couldn't really make the students read the material that I like them to read. And so I wanted to offer something that was more easy and digestible for them, but at the same time correct, right? So I took that material and I expanded it and I put it together into a book that I was first thinking, well, this at least is something that I can use when I guess in yoga teacher trainings, I can ask people to read this book and they have everything in this very comprised format. But then the book kind of took off. Um, it got a life of its own. And it sold quite a few copies in Sweden, which is where I first wrote it. And then Motilal Banarsidass, which is the oldest Indology publisher in India, approached me and they asked me if I wanted to publish this in English. And so I translated it. And this was at the same time as I started my PhD. So I was kind of busy. So I know there are quite a few typos in the book, but I did my best translating it. And then it came out, I think the Swedish one came out 2021 and the English one 2023. And at first, I was a little bit embarrassed about it. Just as when I started teaching in English, I was like, well, there are so many brilliant teachers that have English as their mother tongue. Am I really needed in the international community, so to speak? But then, of course, a lot of people really benefited from the book. And so it's a book that tries to straddle discernment and devotion and the academic point of view with the point of view of a long-time practitioner. And so I really bring in the academic material, and at the end of every chapter, I give some study questions that you can actually use this book in your yoga teacher training. And I also give a read more list so that you can look into, if you're interested in reading more about a particular subject, then I can help you out with some more literature on that subject. So yes, it's a short little book, but I try to get everything that I think is most important for curious practitioners or yoga teachers in there.
It's a huge accomplishment, especially given that you've essentially written it twice because you've written it in two languages. It's just incredible. You've really written
Well, it
two
really was,
books.
the power of Saraswati. It was, I doubted that process so many times. I really felt like, you know, is this book really needed? Why now? I have some other things to do with this. But I really had that, like Saraswati pushing me all through the process, just like when I started my online school. And I know better than to not listen when she tells me so clearly to do something. I just go ahead.
It's
And so I
incredible.
hope that the book has been helpful to some people out there.
I have no doubt. Well, I look forward to picking up a copy when I'm in India very, very soon. So I look forward to delving into it. And you're an incredible storyteller and you are an incredible teacher. And I think that you absolutely have so much to give the global yoga community. And it's been such a pleasure to chat with you. Of course, we could speak for hours, I have no doubt. There's just so much richness and nectar to delve into with you, which is why I invited you to come onto the podcast, because you've got, so much to give and so much to offer. And I'm deeply appreciative. Would you like to take a moment just to share anything that you've got coming up? I know that you're also taking a group to India. Anything you want to share with us?
Yes, so you can find my online courses, of course, through my Teachable page, and they ran live when I gave them, but now they're there for self-study. But you can always reach out to me through email if you have questions and so. What I'm doing live this autumn is an online course called Taste, together with a colleague of mine, Anja Berg. And we're gonna take a group of students through the 9 rasas, the 9 flavors
Wow.
of reality. So we're gonna have weekly classes, 90-minute classes, where we're gonna merge movement, mantra, meditation, and tantric philosophy. So that's coming up. We're starting in September. And then, as you said, I'm taking a group of students on a retreat to India, along with Mystic Art retreats, Bhakti retreats devoted to Hanuman. We're going to go to the ashram of Neem Karoli Baba in Kainchidam in October, November. So that's going to be beautiful. And we have 2 seats left. So make sure to get in contact if you want to come with us. And then in the springtime, we're going to have another Shakti retreat. We don't really know where yet, but the details will be up soon. So if you will want to study with me in person, you can come to the retreats. If you want to study with me live online, you can sign up for the Taste course.
We'll pop some links in the show notes for those tuning in. So if you're listening to this, you can just jump in there now and have a look at those. But highly recommend that you connect with Tova on Instagram as well at Saraswati_studies. Are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to add?
No, we're so grateful for you. It's always a pleasure, speaking with you and to have a listener that is so steeped in these traditions and in this knowledge. It's just beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Deeply appreciative for your time, Tova. It's such a pleasure. If this episode was of value to you and your life, please subscribe. And if you can think of someone who would benefit from this dialogue, please do them a favor and send it their way. If you feel called, hop on over to iTunes and leave a 5-star review. This is the best way to get these conversations into the ears and hearts of our wider community, to those who need it most. You can find me at amyelandry.com or over on Instagram at amyelandry. May we all move a little closer to a life living in alignment.